All right. Gee, dude, like, are we serious here? Fucking, yeah, fucking.
Danny Daniels tipped $1. Hello, Papa Gut, I'm new here. What are your thoughts on the smell of fish?
Not bad. I like fish.
Standing wipers are superior, and I am a sitting wiper. It seems us sitters are now our marginalized group and we are offended. Checkmate conservatives.
It's true. It's true. All right.
That pretty boy is gonna be used and abused in prison.
Yep. Here's what it is. Just so you guys know, if you have Amazon Prime, you get 1 free Prime sub every month. Exclamation point Prime in the chat allows you to utilize it. Some on Papa Gut. So, Ben Shapiro apparently had a conversation with Neil deGrasse Tyson. Am I saying that? deGrasse? I liked that show. It wasn't too bad. Watched the first several seasons with Drake in it. It wasn't that bad. And apparently they talked about their thoughts on transgenderism. Now, I'm not sure when this happened exactly, because sometimes the full interview is here. So, yeah, it's an hour long from like 2 years ago. I kind of figured that. And like Ben Shapiro has been going back and clipping some of his older stuff and throwing it out there. Now, the only criticism I have of deGrasse is that he doesn't shut the fuck up. Remember on the Joe Rogan thing, I saw the meme where Joe Rogan tried to talk and then he wouldn't stop talking. It was funny. It's about deGrasse Tyson. I said Titan. No. Anyway, let's get into this. We know Ben's perspective on trans people. He doesn't think that. He thinks that they have, like, they're delusional and this, that, and the other thing. My perspective is this. Gender dysphoria is being changed in its classification to a sexual health condition. I think that is a gross mislabeling of it because it's not a sexual health condition. It makes sense to be labeled as a mental disorder, specifically because of how distressful it is to be, when you have gender dysphoria. Now, for context, the reason they want to change is because people are saying that, oh, they have a mental disorder and invalidating, their experiences. Just so you guys know, ADHD is a mental disorder. I think that it's a better fight to have rather than reclassify it to something else that's completely irrelevant, to just fight to destigmatize the word mental disorder. Just because you have a mental disorder doesn't mean that you're a bad person. Like, we need to destigmatize that, and I think that's the fight that's better. That's what I would say. Hell, they could have relabeled that to, like, gender anxiety disorder or something. I don't really know. Either way, the treatment method is what I focus on more than anything else. The treatment method for...
Hopefully this will help.
Oh, thank you so much.
To rest a little easier without fear of Mama Gut's surprises.
Thank you. I focus on treatment methods when it comes to treating people for particular issues in general. And it seems like that it is independent of each person what method of treatment will work best. Some people who have gender dysphoria do better to align their gender identity with their biological sex. But most people who have gender dysphoria don't do that. It's better off for them to slowly transition. And while you transition to your ideal body, you also rein in what your ideal body would be so that you hit like a point of realism so that you can be happy. It's part of like learning to love yourself while at the same time accomplishing a particular goal of looking a particular way. And so I support that. That seems to be the best treatment method. Of course, there are people who detransition, and there's like a whole conversation around detransitioners. But just because we have a conversation about detransitioners doesn't mean invalidate like the general successful treatment method of transitioning. Now, I know a bunch of people will say, but Papa Gut, the rates of suicide attempts are just as high when people transition. So, like, you're an idiot. It's like, well, I just want you to understand this particular phenomenon that we don't talk about enough. And that is the phenomenon of when you have a mental health condition, when you start to work on that mental health condition, the suicide rate goes up. See, this is one of the things that we don't talk about. Let's say that you're a massively depressed individual. Well, so for those of you who don't know, the massive depression comes with lack of energy and desire or will to do literally anything. What ends up happening is you don't flip when you get treatment and you start taking medication, it's not flipping a light switch. You're not going from depressed to happy. It's more like a light switch where you shift it up, so it goes from off to like on. You know what I'm talking about? The dial ones. And so you start to feel better, right? Your depression goes down, but it doesn't go away. A dimmer switch. It doesn't go away. It starts to go down. You're less depressed, but you're still depressed. You're still past the point of the threshold of depression. The difference is you have the energy to kill yourself now. And it's something we don't talk about enough, I think, because that's, I think, when you're most vulnerable, is when you're getting treatment for a particular illness, is when you're most vulnerable. You have a burst of new energy, you're still sad, and you're still you could succumb to your desires, and I don't think we talk about it enough. And I think that what exacerbates that problem is because we don't talk about that, it makes people feel like when they start to have more suicidal thoughts, that means that like it's not working and that they might as well take their own life, rather than acknowledging like, hey, this is going to happen. You need to have like a support system for a few weeks as you slowly move through this, and understand that this is part of the process. You're getting better. So let's get into this.
It seems like the left is militating against the advent of science. One of those areas is the area of transgenderism. The argument that is...
Oh, for context, people told me, like, oh, that Neil deGrasse, did I say right? Tyson, like, schooled Ben on this, so we'll find out.
By gender theorists is that gender is entirely separate from sex. You've seen the argument made that it makes no difference on average if men are stronger than women are, and that if we were to allow transgender women to compete with non-transgender women, then this would somehow not disadvantage biological women. And this seems to me...
There is a bit of like a disturbance in the way that we talk about trans people from a lot of woke people, not even trans people, woke people. Because like gender is a derivative of sex. Like quite literally, we create our social construct of gender based off of sex. That's like a fact. But that doesn't mean that they have to be like exclusively tied together. And it doesn't mean that some people, based on some kind of issue in their life or like some kind of biological or environmental factor, can't identify in another way. You know, like I said, gender is a social construct. It's a derivative of the construct of sex, which is really more of a biological construct. But we do have like weird, dishonest conversations, because if you are a trans person, a trans woman, you can definitely, we're actually going to go through an article, because you definitely can exclude cisgendered women by allowing transgender women to compete.
Absolutely ascientific. That if we're actually going to have a discussion about gender and sex, that should be based in data, which suggests that mammals are in fact binary in terms of their sex, unless you...
And just so you know that, like, you know, we are the only mammal, I would imagine, in existence with critical thinking skills. So, of course, we have the ability to create social constructs and think outside of, like, the norm, of what we consider the norm.
Have intersex birth defects, typically, or genetic defects.
I'm happy to opine on this.
Opine?
This only matters because today we segregate nearly all sports by gender.
Yeah, we should. But we should do it by sex.
Why do you even give a shit? what someone identifies with? So we live in a free country, and with consenting adults and people free expression of who and what they are.
Man, on adult level, I agree with you. I think it does matter what you teach
your children. That's what I'm saying. And so there's the matrix of you know, what you are biologically, how you express yourself, who you choose as a sexual partner. If we actually live in a free country, as we tell ourselves, people's freedom to behave in any of those ways.
Yeah, it's acceptable. I think one of the things is that like conservatives generally be like, okay, you exist, you do what you want, but I'm just not going to call you a man or a woman or whatever you want to be called. I also think that the fact that like we have sports where of course we divide people up by we should be doing it by their biology. Because like if we didn't divide people for sports, women wouldn't be able to compete. Like it's an objective fact that like if we only did sports based on your biology exclusively and we didn't separate it by male and female, women wouldn't be able to compete. We should have places women want to compete, so we made a women's like division. Like it really is that simple.
Should not concern you at all, nor are they requiring that you behave that way. Okay, well, this is for their own freedoms, because we live in a free country. Now, what is unresolved here is, what do you do with sports? It's unresolved. And I follow that closely, and I don't see any meaningful solutions to come down off of that.
That's fair.
We know that hormones manifest differently in different people, and just the whole thing with steroids. Steroids are hormones, right? And
steroids are banned.
Rallied against steroids in professional sports, because it gives you an undue advantage. So, and I've tried to think of what the future of sports would be in the world of a gender spectrum. And it may be, you don't specify whether it's a male or female sport. You just take measurements of what your hormonal balances are.
Why? Like, we're just going too far at this point. Just make it male and female sports based on biology.
And so you compete based on your I mean, this is thought I had. I mean, I don't know. I don't know where it's going to land.
I'll give him the credit that's saying I don't know, because I've heard this before and it's just dumb. It's just like it's just like it's a nice thing to think about, but like what's the logistics? So you're going to measure everything. Sports is supposed to be about who's biologically superior. So we're having a conversation that centralizes around, should we look at this from the perspective of gender identity or your biological sex? And I would argue that you're better off of going with like your biology, because you're trying to find out what the most capable female or man is. And so if we do allow trans women to compete, they're going to win over cisgendered women. And so very clearly from an outcomes perspective, you're going to not have cis women be able to compete at all. So like then what is even the point anymore? We're going to create what, a cisgendered women's league? Like, you understand?
The WNBA won't be in business for very long if that's the case.
It would just be...
Well, no, the WNBA would probably do a lot better because it would be more entertaining to see people being able to play better. But it's not necessarily about entertainment at this point. It's really more about inclusivity for women.
You'd have to find some way to compete people against each other if you still care that sports is an interesting activity.
I guess the area where it does come up in a non-sports
area. You ever notice, sorry for pausing so much, you ever notice that the people who complain about the sports the most are people who aren't interested in sports? You know, like people who are complaining that like biological women should be based off of your biology are people who actually watch sports.
Yeah, tell me, I don't know.
So it would be, you talk in your book about the education of children and teaching children about science. And right now, children are being taught about the quote-unquote gender spectrum, which is not scientifically based. That is a theory-based idea.
No, wait, hold on. People express themselves on a spectrum. So you learn that.
That's a social point, not a scientific point.
Well, sure, but like then Ben Shapiro, of course, wants to teach the social idea of like, you know, having the nuclear family, and these are all social constructs.
Meaning we express ourselves
hold on.
based in different languages. Is that something you teach in science class, or is that something that you teach when you're teaching language?
So
that's fair.
Whether the fact
do they teach that in a biology class?
Themselves on a spectrum, on a gender spectrum.
Because then I guess my only criticism would be like, yeah, make sure it's in a gender specific, like gender theory, and make sure people understand that it's like a social construct, and don't teach it in like your science class though.
Whether that fact is something you want to put in a sociology class or in a science class, maybe that remains to be determined.
Yeah, you put it in like you put it in more like a sociology class
about real society.
Well, of course, nobody's denying that people identify how they want to identify.
So
the question is, what is the relationship of that to biology? Meaning that the argument is made that trans women are women, for example, and what that
socially
seems to mean is that trans women are identical to women. Now, if people want to say trans women are not biological women, obviously that is the case. But people don't seem to want to say that, although that is obviously scientifically true. Trans women are not biological women.
Yeah, it shouldn't be taught in biology. Yeah, I don't agree with that.
Biological women are biological women.
But where are you going with this? What are you trying to accomplish?
The accomplishment would be like, we should separate things into like uncontestable facts and social constructs. So like when it comes to biology, it's an uncontestable fact that like, you know, you're born a particular way. Now, of course, there can be like variants, whatnot, but from a social construct, which are very important. I'm not diminishing the importance of social constructs. But you should identify it so we understand that it's a social construct, that it's up for debate, and that it's a lot more like loosely defined. And this way we have a better understanding of it. We should categorize these things correctly.
By asking yourself, is it science or is it not science? It's people.
Why is that like a criticism from this guy? Why is that you want to classify things accurately? Like, yes, who cares? Why? What do you mean? This whole argument that nothing matters. So who does? Like, yeah, you should teach social constructs in a class for social constructs, like a sociology class. Biology isn't a class that should have social constructs tied into it. It doesn't make any fucking sense
in society.
But this is.
It's like how are we going to teach like some like interesting social constructs in fucking math? Do you went into like why you know what I mean? Like there are more objective sciences or studies like math and science, and then there are subjective studies like English and art.
This is a perfect example of an area where suddenly it doesn't matter to say things that are just true. Like why is it bad or wrong to point out.
I have another way to approach this.
I have another way to approach this because I want to dodge very basic. This is one of those problems where people just dodge very basic questions. It's like, just be like, yeah, that makes sense. If the whole contestment is like, hey, I would just prefer gender theory to be taught in some kind of like a social class rather than like a sciences class, then you should be like, that's a good point. We should do that. That's all that we need to do. And of course, like, no. What does it matter? I'm a scientist, but what does science matter? It's like, what are you doing?
I care what is objectively true in the world.
Yeah.
As a scientist.
So biology is objectively true.
But let me not say even as a scientist. I just simply care what is objectively true.
Okay.
And science happens to be a pretty potent path to invoke, to find out what is true.
Yeah, objective truth.
So
non-subjective
if people
truth.
express themselves on a gender spectrum, and that is an actual thing in an actual society, if we have not fully explained that scientifically, that's an interesting frontier to study.
So is it like a gender sciences class? Because what I'm hearing is they teach it in a biology class. Now, maybe I'm just ignorant and wrong, but I don't understand. You're talking about objective truths. Gender isn't an objective truth. It's a subjective truth. It's a social construct. So what the fuck? How is this intelligent guy sound so fucking stupid?
If you want to say it's only sociological,
yeah,
then it's the purview of the social sciences.
Okay, that sounds good. Is that what it's like? Am I just ignorant? Is it labeled a social science? I'm totally fine with that. That makes sense. As long as we acknowledge it's a social science. I'm totally fine with that. I feel like the debate here, though, is that like, hey, it shouldn't be part of a biology teaching.
I don't care who studies it. It's an interesting fact about society that's worth
We're not talking about who's studying. We're talking about who's teaching it.
To fight someone and say, it's not biological, it's just your this. It's real and it's there.
Well,
because it's real because it manifests.
But it is real because it manifests. But the question of how to classify manifestation is a scientific question, meaning that, for example, there was a woman over at Brown University. She came out with a study that suggested that there was a phenomenon called rapid onset gender dysphoria, in which a member of a particular group would suffer from gender dysphoria, and this person's immediate peer group would suddenly have an onset of gender dysphoria. This paper was so controversial. That
it's one of those things that we don't talk about it enough, because when it comes to detransitioners as well, a lot of people are just social detransitioners who forcibly identified because it was like cool to do. And that's not a diminishment on trans people, because everybody did that in high school to some capacity. Everybody does that in some capacity. Like when I was in school, I say this all the time. I would talk about metal, and I was gatekeeping metal. Like, that's not real metal. Like, I was a fucking loser. Everybody does that. So you have people, young kids, that are forcefully identifying as trans when they're not. And then they all, like, one person does it, then everybody else does it, because it becomes a trend. Trans doesn't become a trend. Transgenderism, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't become a trend. But some people utilize it as a trend. Like, there are people who were bisexual in high school that they weren't really bisexual. There's always toxic gatekeeping from loser kids like myself inside of high school. And the reason that we need to talk about it is because, one, we need to talk about detransitioning more honestly, but then also the detransitioning statistics for people who socially identify as trans but don't actually have any like type of symptoms and don't like have a diagnosis, they're very high detransition rates because they never had it in the first place. And so if you say that those should be included in the detransition rates, then you're being dishonest when it comes to people who have diagnosable gender dysphoria. We need to understand the detransition rates of people with diagnosed gender dysphoria. So
Brown tried to pull it, and then was forced to reassign it later. You see this sort of
treatment.
That's a
different question. What you're asking now is, are there some topics that should not be studied scientifically?
Right.
And
what are you talking about?
Is there some taboo? Sam Harris speaks a lot.
He didn't talk about that at all. He just said that I think we should socially classify it. I'm so confused.
Yes.
And I think the concern is, if you study some topic that's a hot button topic and you bring scientific methods and tools to it, we don't trust. I'm interpreting here. I think we as a society don't trust that people in charge in a free country won't try to legislate something that will constrict people's freedoms.
So what you're saying is that we shouldn't be studying the social phenomenon of like onset transgenderism or whatever they called it, because then people might like try to legislate anti-LGBTQ laws. That doesn't make, what the fuck?
The face of that information. I think that's the fear.
Well, isn't that?
Who cares? In a country where you're supposed to have freedom of speech, we should restrict freedom of speech so that we can't make legislation against people. This doesn't make sense.
It's a fear.
I mean, and isn't that?
We don't trust.
Yeah, that's exactly what I said. He doesn't want people to legislate laws that hurt others. Okay, that doesn't mean that you restrict people's ability to study things like a social phenomenon of people overly identifying as transgender. This doesn't make any sense. He's literally like, yes, I think that the government should be able to lie to you as long, just out of what the government would consider to be, as long as that they're being altruistic. Like, excuse me, yeah, the government should be able to restrict and lie to you so that we don't have any bad boy laws. So that means that we don't get to have a social conversation about it.
Our own ability to govern ourselves in the face of what could be some information relative to other kinds of information.
Isn't that a bit of a problem?
Yes.
I mean,
yeah. Yeah, it's not. It means it's not a free society. It's not a society of free inquiry, which I think you need ultimately. But yeah.
My general take on
why is he dancing around? So maybe I got that wrong, and he's supporting that they should have studied that. Why is he dancing around the questions and overcomplicating the answers?
on all of this stuff from climate.
It's unnecessarily overly complicated. It sounds like he's trying to walk on eggshells so he doesn't cancel himself.
Change to gender dysphoria, to all of these issues, is bring out the science and then let's hash it out. I think that the problem I'm seeing on a lot of sides is,
what is your motivation?
Why? Why does that matter?
It matters because if you have political power, you could end up creating legislation that subtracts freedoms from people who...
Oh, no, yeah, so Ben's like, yeah, we should use the objective facts. And he's like, well, why would you want to use facts when we talk about things? Because then you could hurt people. It's like, okay, you can propose... you can absolutely propose the idea that we should keep in context like social constructs of being trans. That's a completely rational counter. When you want, if you want to talk about science, so here's how you would counter Ben Shapiro's science, like a gender science or sex science, whatever, with your own science. Simply put, you say, okay, so what's the best treatment method for people with gender dysphoria? Statistically, it's going to be to help them transition. So if the goal is to get them to be individuals that get to be inserted into society and succeed as much as possible, wouldn't we want to go along with the best treatment method? And then what do we lose by validating trans people? We lose nothing as a society other than slightly blurring the lines between male and female and gender and sex. But that's not, that we don't lose nearly as much or really anything at all. Meanwhile, people with gender dysphoria, they get acceptance. So this is all we really have to do. Instead, we're playing this weird game of like, oh, you want to talk about facts? Well, why? What's your motivation for talking about facts? It's just a ridiculous approach. And like, it's just dumb. It's just dumb. And it's not an honest conversation.
Who previously were enjoying the same freedoms as you. The history of that exercise
then make a better argument.
Doesn't end well.
Well, but the history of which exercise? Bring out all the science and let's hash it out?
I'm saying if you bring out all the science and the politicians hash it out, the history of that exercise is a recipe for disaster if it involves discoveries that put people's freedom as defined in our Constitution.
Yeah, so what he's saying is we shouldn't have honest conversations because some people might get restricted. What I'm more focused in is that, like, why if we should be able to have an honest conversation in order to move forward. That's it. Politicians are a representation of us as individuals. So, like, of course, they're the ones that are going to have these conversations. That's how our system works. It's flawed fundamentally, but that's just how it works. Like, we should be able to be talking about that, and we should be able to, like you just look at it. Like, you should be able to leverage this against anything. Like, this should be a conversation we can have. Like,
at risk.
But now you're arguing for limitations on areas of particular study.
No, I'm arguing on we need a way to shield, we need a way to protect people's freedoms in the face of whatever gets discovered scientifically.
Freedom of speech and expression, right? Like, let's expand LGBTQ people into, I guess, the Civil Rights Act, right? And then It just sounds like we're not having an honest conversation, because even with all of the facts in and everything, you could still validate trans people. It's just a way that, which is what I just did.
So
I'll give it.
I agree. I think that's what the Constitution is for, is to guard rights from.
But we're always fighting.
No, it's not his area of expertise, but that's like one of the problems, is that like Tyson's speaking to, he's speaking with too much authority in a situation he very clearly knows absolutely nothing about.
People who want,
like, he's an astrophysicist, right?
Are always fighting others who are saying they don't get the rights from the Constitution. This is a daily challenge on the progressive left. It is a daily challenge, right? Here's an example. I forgot how I ended up.
I am aware that Neil's fear is that he will use science to take away rights from trans people. I understand that. And I don't want that to happen. But that's what I'm saying, is that you can still validate trans people through like just the social construct alone, as well as the science of focusing on the best method of treatment is to validate trans people from their own perspective. So like, if the problem is like they're suppressing, he seems to want to suppress the honest conversation about trans issues for no reason.
Getting this phone call
when we should be having the honest conversation about it.
It was some magazine that serves the gay community. And they want, I don't remember why, because they wanted my opinion on, they wanted my opinion about whether being gay was biological or mental.
Right, there's that new study that came out, this vast
or
study.
Psychological.
Right,
okay?
Right.
And I said, I don't care which it is.
Okay.
Find out what it is, fine. But the answer to that question should have no consequence on legislations or laws.
I agree, but like what? So then why isn't that your same perspective on like discovering things about trans people? It doesn't really make sense. Like, okay, so let's say that being gay is like purely social. Who gives a shit? There's nothing lost as a society to validate gay people. Same with trans people. So like, what is the science of what? Oh, well, it's hereditary, or it's environmental, or it's a mixture between hereditary and environmental factors. Like, who really gives a shit? My taste for food is a mixture between hereditary and biological factors. Are you going to force me to eat fucking tacos every night? No, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, we could have the science and we can acknowledge, like, oh, things come from, everything is a mixture of biological factors and hereditary factors. It's just like, this is just a weird argument that he's making, because what he's saying is that when it comes to gay issues, like, yeah, let's acknowledge them. But when it comes to trans issues, like, hey, yeah, we shouldn't study the sciences because then politicians might use that to implement anti-trans laws. But it's like, we need to fundamentally be able to have the conversations and not limit people's freedom of speech, because what ends up happening here is like, let's say that people are trying to do studies about trans people, right? And then they get restricted. You're restricting freedom of speech. You want to know what ends up happening? People get incredibly skeptical. They think that there's some kind of a conspiracy narrative against people who question trans issues. And then you develop massive hates towards trans people. That's what it is. And please, yes, that is exactly what's happening.
Because, for example, suppose it said it's purely biological, okay? Then you say, oh, that explains it. Suppose it says it's purely psychological. What are you going to do now? You say, well, now you're going to go to the reorientation camps or whatever those are called?
No.
Where they realign you because they say it's psychological rather than biological. All of a sudden, people start behaving in ways in society that want to constrict the freedom of expression of who and what people are. And that is a danger.
Yes, but you still can't restrict people's freedom of speech and expression to study these issues out of a fear of repressing other groups.
So maybe there needs to be a line in the sand. Let science do what it does. But politicians keep us free. Yet there's so many politicians that are doing the opposite of that.
So why aren't you a libertarian?
And that scares me.
I'm a libertarian. Come over here. Just
okay.
The line is right here. Just join me over here. It seems
okay. Cool. So really quick, Agent Excellence. I know that you're in my chat, and I need you to understand that you got to chill out, because I know that you're sitting here telling everybody that they don't have the ability to critically think and hear, but you quite literally darn understanding what's being said in this video. What Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying is that he's very hesitant about discovering or going through the scientific studies of trans or different trans phenomenons, such as like the onset transness, where there's a forceful identification of being like trans within, like, you know, mostly in like younger communities. We should be hesitant to talk about and be honest about things, because that we could have some really worthless, shitty politicians who will try to restrict the freedoms of trans people because of it. The problem with doing that, that's what he's saying. I'm not asking you a question anymore. What a problem with that is that when you try to restrict that, it ends up putting a conspiracy narrative into people's heads, and it makes them more transphobic. What we need to do is let the studies come out and then logically go through a chain of events to validate trans people through. If your frame of thought can't hold up to any criticism, your way of thought sucks. Validation of trans people can hold up to the criticism of like rapid onset transgender identification in children, because children are annoying and dumb. They forcibly identify, but those people who are socially identifying don't have an impact on trans people who are diagnosed, whether you want to say it's a sexual health condition or a mental illness or whatever. Those are two very separate things. In any field, in any community, there's going to be individuals who will weaponize that community and be toxic, mostly children. Like I said, even did it in like the metal community. It's just that the stakes are much lower in the metal community, right? So my point being is, like, rather than try to push away the research and the studies, like, let's embrace the research and like just you overcome the research, like the way I just did. That's what I'm trying to say.